Hello, and welcome to this episode of Build Beyond, where we'll be talking about payments performance, what that means to merchants, to their partners, and to the rest of the ecosystem, how performance is measured, how it can be meaningfully benchmarked, and that billion-dollar question, how it can be improved. First, though, a little bit of background on Build Beyond. It was a series of virtual panel discussions launched by checkout.com in 2020, been very successful, has continued to run over the last 3 years. And really it's aimed at bringing together a targeted group of senior product, e-commerce or payment leaders from other forward-thinking businesses to discuss various topics within payments. It's a chance to hear experts talk about their learnings and experiences and how they're building beyond the here and now and looking to the future. In previous episodes, we've looked at the changing and currently challenging macro environment for merchants and the fact that it's more important than ever for businesses to focus on their payments as a catalyst for operational efficiency and as a lever for growth. Today, we'll be looking in greater detail at exactly how payments leaders can pioneer a meaningful uptick in performance, which results in greater conversion, loyalty, and revenue growth while cutting costs, fees, and fraud. So I'm delighted that I couldn't have a better set of panelists to join me for this conversation. And so with no further ado, really thrilled to be able to introduce to you Lily Varon, who's a senior analyst, payments expert at Forrester, and Melissa Pottenger, another seasons payment expert, who is head of key partnerships at Reach. And before we get stuck in with the sort of topic at hand, it would be great if each of you could just give a slightly fuller introduction to yourselves and what you're doing at the moment. So perhaps, Melissa, if we start with you and then Lily.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, Julie. Happy to be here. I think that given the experience I have in payments and having been on, my joke is like been on every side of the transaction, right? It's brought a unique understanding of what some of the challenges are and how we look at the business and what affects our prerogative, basically, when it comes to payments. So excited to be here and chat more.
Yeah, and I'm a studier of payments, and I primarily focus on one part of the transaction, which is in the accepting of and processing of the payments. So I research merchant strategies and consumer trends at Forrester around payments acceptance. And I mean, increasingly, payment strategies are more about kind of money movement in general. I'm sure we'll get to that in the conversation. But we joke, that I cover the taking payments, and I have a colleague at Forrester, Jake Morgan, who covers the making of payments in terms of covering the infrastructure and whatnot. And the players that help create the payment experiences. But I am really thrilled to be talking about this because I think it's quite a juicy topic.
Thank you both. On the topic of this being a juicy theme, Lily, I know that you're actually, as well as the experience and knowledge you've just described, currently in the middle of a big piece of research precisely around payments optimization. And so I thought it would be a great way to start the conversation to get a little bit of peek under the hood in terms of what that research looks like, what you're looking into. And I suppose maybe by understanding what you're looking at, it'll help us to understand the way you're thinking of what payments performance actually means, because sometimes that can be a nebulous term and it doesn't need to be.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting because as I've been covering sort of payments trends and trying to predict what's happening in the next few years, from 2020 on, it's been quite an interesting roller coaster. We've been on this sort of upward trajectory, I think, where payments were really strategic and innovation, and payments was getting a lot of attention and resources. And then we're sort of rounded down into this. Or maybe the brakes are a little bit on for a lot of firms where, okay, this is, sort of in endemic stages and we're figuring out, money is tighter. We're getting a little bit more conservative or more discerning about our innovation investments, and payments is almost on the chopping block, right? Further investment in payments is getting kind of it used to be, it was got the spotlight and it was under a microscope for in good ways, right? To invest in it. And then this year, we're starting to see kind of the spotlight and microscope in more like a chopping block. And so we started to think about, well, how do we make the most of our payments technology investments and our payment strategy in this environment? And we started talking about optimization, because it's, how do you make the most out of what you're doing? And it was fascinating as soon as I jumped into this research, because there's still so much to be done, right? There's still a lot of new frameworks, a lot of innovation happening in sort of data management and other things like that. And it challenges this concept of payments as a commoditized service. Because if it was commoditized, there wouldn't be so much left to do. There's still so many kind of technologies and solutions out there that are helping improve the performance and having material impact on the performance of payments acceptance and payments processing. So that's what we're uncovering, is sort of what is optimization today? What are the pieces that make up an optimization strategy? To your point, Julie, you talked about earlier the kind of cost components and the fraud components and the acceptance or authorization components. Those are three big ones, but what are in those buckets? What KPIs are they impacting? What can merchants accept? So that's the research that I'm kind of, sleeves up digging into at the moment.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, Lily, and I'll come to Melissa in very short order to get a sense of, Melissa, your take on it. But I suppose just quickly before I do, the way in which you're going about this, my understanding is that you're talking to, you're doing sort of in-depth interviews with lots of different suppliers as well as merchants. Is that right? Because I think I mentioned at the beginning that we'd look at this from the merchant perspective, but also making sure that partners have got an aligned perception of performances. And I wondered how that's coming through.
Well, it's such a good question, because the one of the key questions I'm asking is, what is the merchant responsibility in payment optimization, and what is the vendor or partner provider kind of responsibility here? Because at the end of the day, getting the best out of the payments performance is what merchants expect from their partners, right? So how do we delineate between kind of the vendor services and offerings and packaged and bundled services versus what kind of the payments optimization team, if there is one within the merchants, is doing? And that line is not, there's not a clear kind of delineation. So precisely that's why I'm kind of going at this from both angles.
Fascinating. And there's so much there for us to come back to and unpack. But Melissa, I know, as well as the interesting work that you guys are doing at Reach Crossborder, which we'll come to, you've got a background, I believe, in WorldPay, Visa as well, as you mentioned, all these different sides of the ecosystem. I wonder how you respond to what Lily's just described in terms of her research, and whether it resonates with you as an area that still needs further uncovering, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I don't know that we'll ever pinpoint what the answer is. And I think it varies wildly from merchant to vertical to provider. It is a vast ecosystem, right, of all of these key players. So I think understanding what a merchant, what their goal is, who their audience is as far as their customers, and then choosing partners that can meet them where they are. So are they in a position where is it buy it or build it? Are they leaning on a partner to help them with strategy, to help them with implementation, or are they really taking the reins on that? That's going to run the gambit, right? Depending on the type of business you are and what your goals are and how much of the process you desire to own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that is coming up in this research is there's some calls that the merchant has to make around, where these kind of fraud determination decisions happen, and how a lot of payments technology or payments adjacent technology tends to be additive, and all these services tend to be additive. And so one of the toughest, and one of the reasons I think it varies so much is depending on how much data you manage, which of these varied payments partners or layers of the, slices of the ecosystem are most important to you, which have risen as sort of co-innovation partners and therefore get more privilege to your data as a merchant, that will completely change the way you operate and the way you make these decisions about how to optimize, and how much is on your plate versus how much is on a partner's plate or various partners' plates.
Absolutely. And just to echo what Lily's saying, I think when you understand, your market base, your consumers, you're going to have the best feel for what your comfort level is on fraud specifically. So I'm excited to chat about that. That's a big topic. And it's really important for a merchant to have a sense of that, to be able to either make those determinations on their side, or to have a really good consultancy in a relationship with a provider that can really tweak those rules to, ward off fraud, but let those good actors through. Very important.
And one of the things I want to add here too is so going back to that initial point of like, what are the three pillars of, or what are the pillars of payments optimization? I think that those, even how you define that as a merchant, this is what sort of, and as a partner, this is another way to find alignment, right? Because certainly there's these three buckets of cost, reduction and cost control and fraud reduction and risk mitigation, and how you determine, your own comfort as a merchant for risk, based on all of those inputs that Melissa, you talked about before. And then there's this sort of conversion and authorization uplift. And what's come up in this research so far is, how do you define the payment partner's sort of remit or the boundaries of their control of that conversion or that authorization uplift? Because a lot of what we talk about happens traditionally in payments optimization. Even when we're pushing the envelope, we're still talking about what happens after that buy button is pressed, right? The connectivity to the ecosystem, the machine learning for retries and treatments of failures, the connectivity to maybe even the issuer and changing, managing data sharing with the issuer landscape. But increasingly, we're starting to see the lines, that payments partners move even further upstream and optimizing that checkout process, from almost the product detail page in a merchant experience that's more e-commerce, right? There's payment buttons that are moving up to the product detail page, but we're also looking at kind of personalization of the checkout page and of those payment methods using other data inputs, browser inputs, session inputs to translate, to offer various payment methods, to reorder the checkout page according to kind of localization. And this is where the cross-border bit gets kind of interesting too, right? There's that authorization uplift bucket is getting kind of bigger and bigger and bigger as the payment providers are having further and further reach upstream into the customer experience. So that's been something interesting that's come out as well.
That's really interesting, Lee. And I suppose, well, one thing that's kind of obvious and definitely has come across from what both of you have said is that this is just such a nuanced case. There is no one size fits all. It's not just the geography, it's not just the vertical, it's the very detailed nature of the business model and the client you're serving. So are there any ways that we can start to talk about this in a way that offers not generalities, but some sense of a framework or a guide, particularly to those businesses who may have smaller teams and just less resource to kind of go about things? I just wonder, you've talked about that partners are offering more and more and going further upstream, but when it comes to the sort of in-house teams knowing that they're actually getting the best bang for their buck and they're getting all the bucks they possibly can, any guidance there that's coming through for simplifying, I guess, for taking away the complexity?
I think that framework of sort of those three buckets and kind of underpinning some key initiatives under those key buckets is one way to go. And it's a traditional way to go, right? We tend to think of sort of fraud management in its silo, cost mitigation in its silo, a really tough silo, but getting easier. We'll talk about that in a second. And then, or getting more attention from the provider landscape. I shouldn't call it easier because it's cost and payments is always really hard. And then in that authorization bucket, there's a lot. But I think that where I'm starting to, I'm working on this myself right now, is how do I define optimization to begin with, and how do I kind of delineate the different services and sort of technologies or frameworks that might come into play to help. And so what I've started to do is sort of almost categorize them by like quantifiable, measurable impact, right? And maybe other unquantifiable benefits, things that might help, could help. If you've got kind of, if you've checked all these kind of boxes, maybe move on to look at some of these things. And so, I think of things like account updater, and even under there, you've got the sort of, let's say, real-time account updater is this other kind of offshoot versus batch. I think about scheduled retries and smart retries of payment failures as a really big broad stroke. If you're not doing, account updater and you've got card on file as a specific, payment method and approach to your business model, using and leveraging account updater where possible and where it makes sense is a big stroke thing that you can do, right? And under there, exploring the ways in which real-time account updater makes sense. And then the treatment of payment failures, right? So there's a lot of optimization to be done there, and there's some that are more easily quantifiable, like scheduled retries or smart retries on top of that. And then we're starting to see, the card on file tokenization, or what we might hear more commonly as network tokens, coming into play. And so this combination of account updater with the card on file tokens or network tokens seems to be, their powers combined seem to be more than the sum of its parts kind of thing. So we're seeing a lot of that. Those tend to be the most easily quantifiable, and I would say in that order, right? Account updater, the scheduled and smart retries, and the card on file tokens. Those tend to be the big kind of things. Beyond that, we start having these other tactics that can help, but might be maybe harder to quantify, right? You've got orchestration, which is a big, a buzzy thing right now, which is, I would say, a tactic under optimization, but, there's debate amongst payments nerds what the umbrella category is and where it lives. But something like smart routing and orchestration, where you've got sort of decision logic and an engine that kind of routes, makes determinants about the optimum paths for particular, maybe card processing or other things. And then you've got walleting and cascading of payment methods or of processing partnerships, acquirers or gateways. And then you've got the kind of basics, right? Testing services, testing capabilities, dashboards, and data insights, and how actionable those are. That's where interestingly enough, a lot of time is being spent, because more and more merchants want to roll their sleeves up and see their data. And even if they're not, let's say, taking responsibility for a lot of the optimization, for their own, edification, for their own sense of comfort with their partnership, they like to see what's going on. So we're starting to see, the vendors investing a lot of money in figuring out how can we provide more actionable insights, maybe benchmarks about, these particular KPIs, or, performance based on, this test or that test, and how we kind of help with that. So, it's not exactly a framework for understanding optimization, but each merchant, to Melissa's point, can make their own kind of bucketing of understanding what services there are. But I tend to think about it as, what are the sort of the most measurable versus the squishier, from most measurable to least measurable or quantifiable from a benefit perspective, and bucketing those services from there and ensuring, as you're maturing, that you've mastered, to the extent that you can, some of these more traditional optimization methods. Because I know I've been talking for a long time, but I'll say one more thing. I'm still shocked how many folks aren't taking advantage of things like Account Updater or some of these much more well-established practices. So even though we might be, talking about what is bleeding edge in optimization in a little bit, a lot of merchants still have the opportunity to do some really well-established optimization sort of tactics with their partners. So hopefully that answers somewhat this. How do we make it easier to understand? We try to identify, we use those three kind of pillars as an umbrella category, and then from under there we start sort of bucketing these more easy to understand, traditional, easier to quantify optimization services, and some things that might be kind of, let's say, traditional services or things like dashboards and testing and optimization, like pre-existing services that are just getting better and more focused on these things, on optimization.
And just to add to what Lily's saying, I think it's funny. I feel like I'm in a yoga video and Lily's doing the deep stretch. And I'm going to give you a novice approach. So everything she's saying is 100% correct. Like, all of these things are very impactful. And if you haven't found the right partner to help you really tap into that at a high level, top of the funnel, we talk about conversion, we talk about checkout optimization, right? Are you using like real-time field validation?
Yes.
Are you using good error mapping? So there's some things you can look at right now in your business and be able to say, am I helping the customer? Is this journey, am I helping them understand what's happening? Otherwise, you're going to get angry clicking. I love that. So, you've got frustrated customers, possibly. That's going to be an irritant. And we all are very, sensitive about our brand, right? We want to have that experience, that user journey be optimal. So I think there is some simple things you can address at a high level, such as these things, real-time field validation, making sure that the error mapping, error messaging is very, very good and helps to guide that customer. Things like that you can tap into right now.
Yes.
And then everything will.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and that's the perfect example of these kind of payments optimization reaching further and further into the customer experience, a little bit more upstream, that optimization of the checkout page. What data does your payment partner have to help you sort of automate these generic, maybe, non-layperson readable errors and data that you're getting back from the ecosystem about the reason this thing failed, to translate that into something that the consumer can help with. How can the consumer be? And this is something that I think is really, again, wildly underutilized. I was talking to a solution provider, who was working on that, right? Trying to say, how can we, help the customer overcome what could be a frustrating customer experience with them based on the data we have about why this thing didn't go through. Is it just, hey, you're missing your CVV? That's possible. But it could also be like, hey, there's some, maybe it's insufficient funds, and we're going to say, try something else, try another card, right? How might we enroll the customer in our payments optimization, activities? It's an incredible point.
And what's wacky too, just to expand on that, is you can look at things, if you just look at data alone, and I think everyone can agree you cannot just look at data alone, but if you do, you'll say, oh, well, gosh, this person clicked a bunch of times, fraud, right? Fraud. So it can blur the lines of really understanding what's happening in your business. So it's really important to be able to address data with qualifying aspects of looking at everything holistically.
Yeah, right. That's one of the things, and I don't have an answer for this yet, which maybe is not a thing an analyst should say, but I think analysts are full of questions as we're researching. one of the things that, is when do you make the determination of fraud, right? Like how far down that funnel are you making that decision? To your point, you may be taking inputs that are maybe too early upstream, and about that case, and a lot of the payments providers will say, hey, don't don't make the determinant based on fraud before it comes to us, because we have this sea of data around these, and scary as a consumer to think about all the data they're collecting on particular consumers and devices and things like this to these networks of data to make the kind of determinant. But that's another key question that merchants kind of have to decide, and what fits for them and their fraud and payment strategy is, where along this line are we kind of making that final determinant factor of, there might be data inputs along the way, but that green light, red light, yellow light, when is that? Where's the traffic light about going to be for our fraud, decisioning?
Right. And there's a million ways to look at it. So if you did look at velocity alone, you just lost a customer.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about, a question to either of you, whether it's come up in real life or experience or the interviews, is the impact of something like 3DS, which I feel that when it sort of was first introduced, there was real skepticism that actually it would somehow drive down conversion. On the other hand, of course, it's meant to, it's kind of, to your point, Lily, around fraud and actually trying to be more, with the soft declines, actually have a bit more flexibility around determining when a fraudster is a fraudster. What are you seeing in terms of the impact on payments performance on the auth and fraud rates at the same time with that?
So this is another area where there's, Melissa's point earlier about kind of there's data and then there's expertise, right? There's kind of human knowledge and consultancy that comes into this. When to deploy 3DS and when there are exemptions seems to be kind of the biggest tool in the merchant's toolbox here, because to your point, it can introduce quite a bit of friction into the customer experience, which is it's less than the old days, right? I think that the first kind of forays into this were much clunkier than they are now, but and sometimes that friction is good, right? We do want to really make sure that this person is who they say they are, but at the same time, and this goes back to the first conversation, the merchant has a lot more data about who this customer is than in their ecosystem, in their world, right? Than potentially anybody else in the ecosystem. Others might have more data to compare that user to the rest of their kind of customer bases, but how might the merchant kind of share more data with the payment partner who's tracking the regulation much more closely, potentially having more resources dedicated to the changing regulatory landscape, which it can be quite relentless, and then they're making a determination of when to actually deploy this and when we don't need to. That seems to be the biggest impact today, and I think that's it's balancing the age-old question of friction for fraud management or a supreme seamless customer experience. It's how well we know that customer and how compliant, where do we need to really introduce this experience based on the regulation. So that's one of the moving pieces that I think data is helping, and partner services are helping merchants. But that's where the data, the more data the merchant shares with their partners, the better, because the more that partner knows, and as long as they can accept it and use it, that partner can make a better determination about when and why to deploy this or not.
Yeah, agreed. I think we haven't touched on loyalty yet, but it's very much in line with kind of what I've been talking about with a consumer journey. Lily talked about friction, 100%. Buzzword of last year, liability shift. Right? Oh, so when is the right time? What's the right AOV? here's my lawyer hat. It depends.
Mhm.
So 3DS can be fantastic, can be a very meaningful tool in a business, and it should be leveraged as such. It should make the consumer feel like there are protections. It should make the merchant feel like they are making transactions more secure. So when you use it, how you use it, understanding that, that's really a fundamental part of your business strategy. So obviously, low transaction value, STA exemptions generally, or TRA exemptions, can be very beneficial. So understanding those and talking to your partner, your payments provider, about when to implement that strategy and how to monitor that with the data is very meaningful.
And Melissa, I know I said I was going to come to the sort of points, more granular points around cross-border and what performance means in cross-border. Obviously, that's extremely complex, and that's kind of the whole point, and why probably a business like Reach makes cross-border their sole focus. But I wonder whether there's anything there to add around, given regulatory differences in every single market served, what that means for a merchant looking to operate across lots of jurisdictions when it comes to fraud in particular.
Oh, absolutely. So I think you're 100% right. Cross-border equals challenges. It equals expensive. It equals confusion. If you know, and this is why Reach is great, right? We're a global financial platform. We help merchants tap into regions and customer bases that, because they don't have an entity there, it would be very difficult to get established, to get higher authorization rates, to get more predictable costs with no crazy fees, because banks have their hands out in FX. So we're solving a lot of problems there, but moreover, merchants want to understand how to excel in those markets. How do you win with those customers? So it's going to be a different balance everywhere you go. What works in Latin America is not going to work in Europe, right? And it gets more granular than that. Ideal and GiroPay, what's working for those customers? You know, Julie, you talked about localization. I could not drive that point home more. Making sure you're presenting customers with the currencies and the payment methods that they expect that are native to them is pivotal, right? And that adds to loyalty as well. So I think knowing that today PSD2 mandates are specific by region, you're going to see more of that. And it's good, right? So prepare your business to understand the customers where they are. Partner with a company like Reach that handles regulation and regulatory concerns and things like taxes. So you want to be prepared. You want to be prepared to win in these markets and understand those consumers.
There's so many fun. So localization is one of my favorite conversation topics because it brings in linguistics. It brings in kind of culture and nuance. Even the way in which you might price something, right, ending with a 9 is very common in the United States. It makes us feel like we've got a good deal, $9.99. Not very auspicious in other countries. You'll see in China, for example, things ending in 8 is a much more auspicious number. And so things will be much more like 888 or things like that. But even the tax point is so important, because I was talking to someone, I think at this point we're at something like 20,000 tax jurisdictions on the globe. 5,000 plus are in Brazil, 11,000 plus are in the United States. So you absolutely need a PhD to kind of understand tax and its implications. And that's one of the places where regulation is changing so quickly, right? Latin America is a great example where there'll be one country that implements a digital, tax on digital goods or digital services, and then other countries follow suit, quickly thereafter, because they let that country sort of be the testing ground for whether this will work or not, and then boom. And that's taking aside the sort of socio-political crises that might also be impacting the region that are important for localization reasons. But this is where, it's never ending. Localization, again, there's all these broad stroke things that you might be able to do that you need expertise to understand. And services and partners that are already in those markets, already serving those customers to help you. But then what localization is in theory is just personalization, right? And localization, is this idea, like in an ideal world, we're personalizing to a segment of one. And that is the hyperlocal experience, right? What I as a consumer like and use and what is convenient to me may be different, or what I expect may be different than a consumer sitting right next to me in a cafe in the market I live in, et cetera. But we do what we can, right? And so localization is, again, one of those things, depending where you are on the maturity curve, what are those big stroke things that you can do? Currency, FX controls, settlement timeframes, the taxes and disclosures, some things. And then, you get beyond that into kind of a linguistic nuance or I think in the market, there's translation, there's localization, and there's transliteration, which is much more that taking into account, how something will land rather than just translating it. Anyway, like I said, I love it. I get nerdy on it. But it's so important.
I was wondering, just to come back to, both of you touched on FX. So beyond all of that really important and kind of juicy stuff around localization as a way of accepting or being accepted as well. So you're accepted in terms of tax law, in terms of regulation. You're also allowing yourself to accept other people's money by having the right payment methods. But actually, if we think about payments performance or payments optimization as ways of literally squeezing the most revenue out of money as it moves into the business, to what extent merchants should be thinking, well, particularly cross-border merchants should be thinking of FX from a sort of from an optimization point of view in terms of their own ultimate benefit from doing it right versus having a cruder approach, I suppose. I wondered, perhaps Melissa, if that's something.
Yeah, so I think it's about transparency, right? I think it's it starts from that we talk about, it starts from the checkout, right? And helping a consumer understand overall costs. You do not want your consumer to get a surprise FX charge on their card, right? You want everything to be addressed up front. That's going to build loyalty, trust, and create that overall better experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the back office piece of that is important too. Like I said, that where I hear about it a lot is in kind of settlement, and where it makes sense for if you've got merchant accounts in multiple markets, regulations allowing to be able to kind of optimize where that money actually settles and when, is another place where FX can come into an optimization play in a business.
Right. And just to add to that, I think it's interesting because when you talk about our business and we talk to merchants all over the world that, again, they want to reach a consumer in a different region, but they don't understand the taxes, and the FX can fluctuate wildly. So how do you really feel like you're going to be able to have some level of predictability? For example, we have a product where we lock in FX for 90 days. So if refunds happen during that period. But if you don't have a relationship like that, these are things that you have to be mindful of. What happens if a refund comes through on a region where I had to FX that transaction?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That goes to what we were talking about earlier about, okay, so acceptance is just one part of the pie. It's a big one. It's one where we spend a lot of time thinking about optimization and payments. But when we think about payments as it relates to gift cards, as it relates to returns and refunds and credits and warranties, there's a lot of ways in which money moves in the customer experience and in our operations that, where optimization, like that's a whole, we could spend many more sessions talking about kind of, all right, what does payments optimization in a refund look like? What does payments optimization in a gift card scenario look like? Payments are becoming so strategic to the business.
Right. And I'll take the deep stretch now. So we talked about localization, and we talked about payment methods that a merchant is going to, or a customer, a consumer, a shopper is going to have a preference for. Lily, in the US, what are you looking to pay with? But the flip side of that, as a merchant, what is your exposure? So we have to be mindful of the payment methods you're offering. Well, number one, analysis paralysis. Do you have too many? Do you have too few? What's the right blend? Talk to your partner about that. Reach takes a very serious approach to being able to guide merchants on what works for their business. So what are the consumers looking for? If you're a high-end luxury retailer, BNPL, yeah, absolutely. Have that on there. Have 3 of them? Probably not, right? So depending on your region, you may have payment methods that have very long dispute windows. Do you really want that? Can you really take a luxury good back 2 years later? Is that how it works? So think about exposure, think about refund timelines and dispute windows, because all of that also really matters in the grand scheme of things.
Yes, absolutely. I love that analogy, deep stretch versus whatever, the light stretch.
If we're thinking about a light stretch, because there are I feel like there are so many different formations of a deep stretch that can be done on this topic, and kind of trying to bring it back to, I suppose, something that is meaningful but can be taken away and useful for a merchant watching this or listening to us. Well, I had a couple of kind of broad questions before we wrap up. One is around blind spots. So Lily, I think you already sort of mentioned that actually the whole topic of payments optimization is in itself quite overlooked, and that's why we're talking about it in the first place, because they're just kind of table stakes things, but they're still not being done as well as they could be. But if there's one kind of major blind spot, or 1 or 2 that you see that you think, merchants, if they were to simply focus on that, they'd already be doing a lot better, is the first question. And the second question that I have for you both is around striking balances. I think what we've seen is that there are all these kind of directions you can go in order to optimize, but they are all about striking an overall balance. So again, to kind of condense that into one metric that you can look at, or a couple that can really tell you you're getting your balances right. I know those are probably difficult questions because they demand a certain simplicity, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Let's light stretch. Okay, so blind spots, I would say I can think of 2. One, I think, is this idea of other, like I've referenced before, other ways in which money moves. So we often get the question, like, should I accept payment method X? Should I accept payment method Y? And that's a bigger question. There's a lot going into it, to Melissa's point that she made beautifully a second ago. But sometimes when you've got critical mass, what consumers are clamoring for is not more payment methods, but maybe better payments experiences across different journeys in your merchant experience, right? So returns, customer service, maybe it's the IVR channel, chat. How are you enabling, payments in other in other experiences? And then the other thing I was gonna say, I already forgot it. Melissa, you go, and if I remember it on the blind spot, I'll bring it back up.
Sure. So, we addressed a lot of this, and I think when we talk about overall shopper journey, let's say that's the top of the funnel, right? And then we get into the actual payment, the transaction, the authorization. We talked about authentication with 3DS. So, and Lily talked about this a lot earlier about what can happen as far as smart retries and account updater and different things like that. A provider like a payment processor that has a global footprint like Checkout, if your provider like that is doing a good job of helping you solution your transaction to be able to yield the ultimate outcome of a successful authorization, that can be accomplished in a lot of ways. Retry logic, messaging, different things like that. So knowing that, you've got a strategy in place when it comes to that, or the right provider, because that can live with you or it can live with your partner. It just depends. It depends on how much of that you want to own and how informed with your own data you are, because some people ask, like, what's the appropriate marriage of where do I end and you begin as a payment processor? And I think that's going to vary tremendously just depending on the type of business. And say, you're looking to get into a region where you don't have an entity and you want to reach that market. A company like Reach is going to help you solution that aspect of it. So understanding that as Reach, we're working with B2C, B2B marketplaces and utilizing a provider like Checkout for the payment processing aspect of it and accomplishing this true like global solution for a merchant that's looking to grow. I think it's good to know that everyone is going to want to be a trusted advisor to a merchant that wants to understand their business better. Because again, we talk about data so much, right? But looking at data and looking at declines and wanting to make improvements and being able to point to that area in the business where that improvement can live can be very challenging.
Yes, yeah, and that goes to the balance piece too. I mean, I think the other piece is ensuring that that you've got, as we talked about everything, the fraud management and checkout experience. Oh, this was my blind spot, which was about balance. Sort of, it is we may be inadvertently creating silos and sort of challenging our optimization by the actual purview, by our organizational structure. So often I'll talk to, especially in retailers and brands, where the payments optimization team is literally has zero input or control or permission to think about the digital experience outside of that checkout page. And so a lot of the optimization that we're talking about, happens beyond that, but increasingly will happen, in the broader kind of customer experience. So how do you think about your payments optimization team as let's say an intersectional or cross-functional team within the organization, so that you're having that more, since we talk about yoga, we can use a more holistic approach to payments optimization. And I think that helps with balance, because then you have to start talking about what are those North Star KPIs that can unify the teams across the organization. And there are imperfect ones, but the authorization uplift seems to be the easiest one for everyone to get on board with. So I would recommend starting there. But then as you build the practice and as you build a more unified org, people and process around optimization, then you can start to get about these really fun other KPIs that might be motivating or might be good for measuring the balance between fraud and customer experience, or other parts of the payments optimization portfolio.
And Lily touched on cost reduction earlier. I think we're all keen to understand our costs better, and to know, okay, what's low-hanging fruit, right? What could I tackle simply? So Julie, and thank you. We talked about cross-border fees earlier. We talked about FX and taxes. So understanding those aspects of your business, where those fees kind of sneak up on you, and how you can address those, take those questions to your payment processor, to your solution provider, and have those conversations, because there are things you can do that may just not be very obvious, but are certainly things you can tackle today.
Mm-hmm. These are really beautiful final answers from you both, Melissa and Lily. I think they're just really clear, and on the one hand, the hidden, and well, actually, Lily, I love how you sort of equated actually that the blind spot is the balance in a way, and it is about having that intersectional and almost multidisciplinary, non-siloed approach, and that is both to auth rates as a starting point, and to your point, Melissa, to costs. They're hidden all over the place. It's like a treasure hunt. You can go and find it. I do not understand where the time has gone. It's been amazing chatting to you both, and our time unfortunately is up. But I know we'll speak again, and I look forward to it in many different capacities. And Lily, we look forward to seeing your research as well when it comes.
I'm excited to make it. Thank you so much for having us. This was so much fun.
It was indeed. Thank you. Thanks both. And thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.